Whoa. My Ignite talk about behavior change in comic books. Comic books, comic books. Alright, so my name is Chris McManus, and this is my presentation about comic books and patriotism. Thanks for joining me today. It's going to be a blast. Edit that part. So I'm going to read off of my phone here because my printer did not work, and I need notes. Again, more edits. So exposure to media has been shown to affect behavior change in individuals, and more specifically modifies sentiment towards feelings of relatedness, autonomy, and competence. Can reading adult themes in comic books increase feelings and sentiments of patriotism and or nationalism in humans under 21? That was the focus of our study. Can reading Captain America increase one's sense of being a patriot? Is heroism a patriotic sentiment that can be manipulated by the use and exposure to comic books as a medium? More specifically, can one be more or less patriotic after visually reading stories of comic book patriots such as Captain America? The theoretical research behind our work suggests that people can be manipulated into feelings of patriotism based upon reading a specific collection of comic books. So let's check it out. Comic books integrate words and pictures into a flexible, powerful literary form capable of a wide range of narrative effects. And in some ways, they modify, in some manner, the behavior or attitudes of those who respond to it. Comic books have been a part of the American culture since 1933 and have mirrored or paralleled the shared history of most Americans. They have at times become a teaching instrument as well, to teach business ethics and social issues in management. According to Gerd and Foster in X-Men Ethics, comic books to teach business ethics, comic books are a means to offer a pedagogy that includes crossing cultural barriers, understanding the complexity of individual decision-making and organizational influences, and the universality of dilemmas and values. So let me read that again. It includes crossing cultural barriers. We understand the complexity of individual decision-making and organizational influences, and the universality of dilemmas and values. All that in a comic book, right? Who would have thought? In other cases, comic books have been used for gaining content area knowledge, curatorial consumption, and personal engagement and reflection. And people basically read to reflect. In this study, we examine the effects comic books have on sentiments of patriotism, and if that sentiment increases, in an attempt to inspire more research in an undeveloped field. So what did we do? We gathered up 26 individuals from a local community college, ages 18 to 21. They identified as either male or female gender, and it had at least some prior knowledge of what a comic book was. They were seated in a group setting in a closed room and could pick out their choice of the 3 comic books offered. Each of the comics offered were selected beforehand by researchers, and in each selection, the storyline involved the main character, Captain America, killing an individual that can be considered Captain America's nemesis. So let me back that up a little bit. What we did was we took 26 individuals from 18 to 21, put them in a room, gave them Captain America comic books. Specifically, Captain America comic books that dealt with the issue of Captain America killing an individual that was a perceived foe. Now, a correlation could be made that these characters that Captain America kills are metaphorical references to enemies of the United States. The specific titles of the comics were Captain America Comics number 2 in 1941, Captain America Comics number 5 in 1941, and Invaders number 21 in 1977. The first two titles, the main character, Captain America, killed either Nazis or Nazi sympathizers. The last title, Captain America, killed Asian giants. Now, before entering the room, the respondents were asked one question as to how they would rate their sense and current state of patriotism. The participants self-reported their sense of patriotism to observers on a scale measuring 1 to 10. 10 being the highest sentiments of patriotism, very patriotic, and 1 being very low on patriotism, not patriotic at all. Once they had completed the preliminary sentiment question, the participants were then asked to go into the room and pick out their comics and read it. Once they had finished reading the comics to their liking, as many times as they wanted, as much as they wanted, they were then asked to put down the comic, not talk to anybody, and then leave the room. Upon exiting, the participants were asked again to self-report their feelings of patriotism after reading those comics. Participants were also asked to gauge on a scale how likely they were to continue reading comics. More readership, or actually they were asked to continue reading more comics similar to Captain America. More readership of that specific title, it is believed to correspond with higher sentiments of patriotism than that of just the self-reporting. So we gauged how they felt about it before they went in. After they read the comics, we asked them again how they rated their sense of patriotism and whether or not they continue reading comic books like Captain America that dealt with issues like this. We figured that the adult readership or the continued readership would actually be an indicator of that sense of patriotism. So what did we find out? Well, prior to the readings of the comics, participants self-reported their sentiments of patriotism as follows in a diagram, with most respondents having a neutral sentiment towards their patriotism. 3 of the respondents felt as though they were very patriotic. 1 person reported feeling unpatriotic. Now, after reading the comic books offered to the group, participants self-reported their sentiments of patriotism, and that information is in this graph. Most respondents still had a neutral sentiment towards their patriotism, as you can see. 3 of the other respondents, though, felt as though they were still very patriotic, and the remaining 5 people actually felt unpatriotic after reading the comics. So, before and after, we can see the sentiments of patriotism after reading a comic book. So, what does that tell us? Well, this hypothetical study was originally created to gauge whether or not and if behavior change could occur due to exposure to comic books as a medium. To be more specific, we wanted to find out as to whether or not an individual would have an increased sense of patriotism after reading comic book titles that dealt with the topics of patriotism. Along with the findings, separate discussions were had between respondents and researchers. This is where it gets interesting as well. The topics of conversation were as follows. Comic books are violent. A topic that came up quite easily for some of the respondents to speak on was how violent comic books are in their portrayal of good versus evil and how it makes people feel. Such a topic was researched by Kirshen Okazak in the effects of extremely violent comic books on social information processing. when they explored the increased hostility in individuals after they read violent comic books. The conclusion of the study was that the effects of comic books were dependent on multiple variables, one of which included gender, males more so than females. While none of the participants self-reported feelings of hostility or anger, it was observed that the participants felt uneasy when discussing violent acts such as murder. Second topic was that these comic books are suitable for children. Comic books have been around for almost a century. The majority of the readership drops off by the time a young person becomes an adult. Typically, comic book readers are male gender, with themes such as murder and nationalism, such as is found in the sample selection. Are comic books really suitable for children under a certain age? A loose discussion followed the experiment, yielded concern about the impact on children. So what happened, the second conversation was that, are these comic books really suitable for kids? Because they're very violent and they do deal with adult themes. Is that appropriate for anybody under the age of 18? The impact of violence in comic books upon children was a topic of research conducted by Kermit Scruggs in his thesis titled Comic Book Violence and Its Effects on Children. In 1976, where he concluded exposure to comic books that contained violence or aggressive material, however, does not appear to increase the child's aggression. Respondents were curious to know if there were ongoing studies of current comic books and their impact on children. Are comic books just metaphorical extensions of current events? Is the last little quick topic that happened after the respondents self-reported. Comic books do have a regular publication rate. Some titles come out once a month, others come out once a quarter. With such a rate of publication, it would stand to reason that comic books echo much of the current events of the day. This reasoning stems from the understanding that there is no shortage of materials for the writers of comics to come up in the current place and time. I think you could agree, right? Additionally, there are continuous social and contemporary issues that seem to be inherited from generation to generation, such as racial inequality, nationalism, that truly have not been developed and addressed by the generation before. So it kind of rolls downhill. Until we reconcile it, it will continue to be an issue, right? Topics like complex economic, social, and political conditions, such as neoliberalism in the United States, are discussed by Catherine Manis when she explored the topic of neoliberalism in the United States in her review of neoliberal anxiety in the post-apocalypse in U.S. comic books. One could argue that the comic book medium is a mirror reflection of our current societal states. A lot of the topics that do get discussed and read in comic books are of an adult nature, and they are very societal in impact. So an interesting thing happened after we tabulated the data. An unknown thesis emerged that refutes the theoretical basis of the original thesis. Basically, we found something that told us we were wrong. The original basis for research was focused on whether or not viewing comics would bring about increased sentiments of patriotism. Contradictory findings create a quandary to the original thesis and demands its own individual research into the adverse effects on sentiment that comic books of this nature can have on an individual. While no major movement in sentiment upwards was achieved on the patriotic scale by the participants in the group, it is noted that some of those that started off neutral in patriotism swayed more or less patriotic after reading the comic book titles. There was an unforeseen event that raises questions about not only the comic book titles and the storylines chosen, but how each comic book had been represented to the participants and how they affect the sentiment on the user. This hypothetical study is not without its limitations. This project was conducted without regard to the impact that the comic books based on a person's gender, meaning we didn't gauge how more impactful the female or the male gender was in our group. We totally took that out. The data presented also lacks information about gender identity. Further study should account for longer time allowances that allow for those to read slower or read through the material more than once if they'd like to. Our participants really just read the comic book one time, set it down, and then left the room. Further studies into this arena should also allow for side conversations to be had. In our survey, we instructed everybody not to talk to anybody in the room until they left the room and they had reported. We are confident that if we had allowed that conversation to happen, perhaps the sentiment would have perhaps stayed the same, may have increased based on the group setting. So, no prior questioning or understanding of the individual's own predisposition to violence or violent acts was taken into consideration, meaning we did not consider whether or not somebody would have an adverse reaction just to the act of murder or violence with regards to the storylines. Perhaps the act of killing somebody was enough to turn somebody patriotic. That is where its own studies. So, at the end of it all, we can tell you that the participants of the study at the beginning had a more positive sentiment of their sense of patriotism. After reading the comic books, the hypothetical theory was not supported. They did not feel an increased level of patriotism. In contrast, some of the participants actually felt less patriotic. Sentiments relayed societal concerns and the impact on children by the group of researchers. So unknown conversations actually happened whether or not these comic books are suitable for kids. And of those surveyed, a good majority were reluctant to continue reading comic books based on this experience. This also disqualifies the theory in this paper, as continued readership was a means of measurement. Now, those that identified on the higher end of the scale did, however, indicate they would continue to read the comic books. Certain group members did feel as though it reinforced their sentiments and feelings of patriotism prior to the study. Overall, the use of comic books as a medium to modify or change behavior has been underdeveloped or researched to date. Comic books have been questioned as to whether or not they can be a method of behavior change in this hypothetical discussion and review of works. Supporting data suggests a continued observation of the media with a focus on the impact on children. Our final findings suggest that comic books could have an adverse effect on sentiments of patriotism and of nationalism. Thank you, and good night.